I spent 6 years of my life helping you build this empire. Harry, Isabella declared boldly in the middle of courtroom 12 of the Royal Courts of Justice in London. That sentence was like a sharpened knife, cutting through the atmosphere thick with the scent of old oak and hostility. I deserve half of everything, including the £4 million from the ownership of your father's oak forest. That money is now our shared asset. Judge Davies glanced at the thick stack of documents her lawyer had just submitted, detailing how she planned to carve up sterling timber, the 5-generation legacy of my family. Isabella sat there in her expensive Burberry coat, the one she had swiped my card for in Mayfair last Christmas, looking at me with the eyes of a hunter who had cornered her prey. She saw a 63-year-old man collapsing, but she was mistaken. My father, old George Sterling, spent the last year of his life designing a special legal architecture specifically for this moment. My name is Harry Sterling, and this is how my father taught a greedy person a costly lesson from eternity. The dull morning sun of London filtered through the high arched glass windows, illuminating the expressionless face of Sebastian Vane, our family lawyer. He sat there, as silent as a bronze statue, his hands clasped on the polished wooden table. In contrast to that stillness was the drama Isabella was creating. She played the role of the abandoned wife perfectly, every tear carefully calculated to fall at the right time. Isabella believed my silence was a sign of failure, an acceptance of surrender before the power of communal property laws in the United Kingdom. In her mind, I was just an old-fashioned man trying to cling to a pile of rotting oak, while she was the one holding the future of this massive fortune. However, deep within my chest, tightening with pain from the betrayal, I felt a surge of electricity as I remembered the ancient oak forests in the Cotswolds. The Sterling family had been rooted in that land since 1895. We had provided the finest timber for castles, palaces, and the greatest structures of this country. Every oak tree that fell was a continuation of a vow, a legacy preserved by the sweat and blood of 4 previous generations. My father used to say that the oak forest never tolerates those who only know how to harvest without knowing how to plant. Isabella did not understand that. She only saw figures, villas, and massive bank accounts. She did not hear the wind whistling through the oak leaves every winter night, nor did she understand the weight of a signature on the ancient documents Sebastian was holding. When Judge Davies asked for my opinion, I just looked straight into the eyes of the woman I once called my wife. In that moment, I saw greed dancing in her dark pupils. Isabella thought she had £4 million firmly in her hand, but she had no idea that the trap had been set 6 years ago, the very moment she stepped into the Sterling Manor with a fake smile. My heartbeat slowed down, becoming more steady. Isabella might have the confidence of a hunter, but I was the one holding the key to the cage. She underestimated me, viewing my patience as a weakness, without knowing that it was the true power my father had passed down. Her contempt for a weary 63-year-old man would be the greatest mistake of her life. A new chapter of betrayal had just begun, but its ending was written by a man who passed away 18 months ago. My father, George Sterling, was smiling from the afterlife, waiting for the moment Isabella's mask would completely collapse under the weight of the very greed she worshipped. The courtroom suddenly became so silent that one could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the wall, marking the final moments of the deception. Everything seemed to be going exactly as Isabella wished, but that belief was as fragile as a piece of rotting wood covered by a layer of glamorous paint. I took a deep breath, feeling the scent of oak and dust, the scent of history and the truth rising. This battle was not just for me, but for everything my father had built. The outcome would not be like what Isabella expected, and the lesson she was about to receive would be the final legacy, the most bitter yet most deserved, that the Sterling family would give to someone who wanted to steal what they had never nurtured. Kindness is an expensive piece of jewelry, and Isabella wore it so perfectly that she turned me blind for 7 long years. She used the very pain of losing my first wife as a springboard to enter the Sterling timber empire, like a savior during a crystal-lit heritage conservation gala in Oxford. 7 years ago, I stood there with a withered heart, like a dead oak tree standing after Mary passed away. Then Isabella appeared. She shone in a sophisticated emerald green dress, her eyes bright when talking about the necessity of restoring the ancient forests in the Cotswolds. She did not just possess a sharp beauty, but also understood forestry to an extent that amazed me. Isabella knew how to touch the pain of a lonely man with gentle words of comfort and a fake understanding of traditional family values. When she moved into Stirling Manor, our ancient mansion seemed to brighten again. She began to infiltrate my life like vines clinging tightly to the trunk of an old tree. Isabella spent hours every day sitting beside my father, old George, during his exhausting dialysis sessions at the hospital. She patiently read to him the poems of Wordsworth or stories of the English countryside in a strangely warm tone. I stood outside the hospital room window, seeing her tenderly adjust the blanket for my father, and silently thanked God for sending an angel while my family was at its most exhausted. But behind the Earl Grey teacups brewed to the exact British taste she made for my father was a plot calculated to every minute. Under the guise of helping me rearrange the chaotic archives from 1895, Isabella began sneaking into the office during quiet afternoons. She cleverly inquired about land ownership deeds, rare oak extraction rights, and the secret contracts the Stirling family had signed with the royal family. Every time I walked in, she smiled gently, her long fingers closing the ancient text pages naturally, as if just doing the good job of a dutiful wife. I was too infatuated with the belated happiness to realize that her gaze did not stop at the heritage oak grains, but was directed at the massive fortune hidden behind them. The climax of the performance was my father's funeral 18 months ago. Under the characteristic drizzle of the English countryside, Isabella knelt in the slushy mud of the cemetery, her hands clutching the oak coffin as if her soul were also leaving her body. She sobbed repeatedly, swearing before my father's grave to protect the Stirling family legacy with me until her last breath. I held her in my arms, feeling the trembling of that body without knowing that her heart was pounding from extreme excitement. Isabella did not mourn for the frail elderly person who had passed away. She cried with happiness, knowing that the last barrier separating her from £4 million was no more. This betrayal did not come from a sudden stab, but it was nurtured through every meal, every cup of tea, and every warm embrace over the past 7 years. She played the role of a perfect wife so well that she herself believed in the deception, while I was still busy believing I had found a peaceful haven for the rest of my life. Everything from the past now returns like a black and white film, where every act of kindness from Isabella carried the chill of a cruel plot, waiting for the day to be revealed in the light of justice. Never trust oaths when the shadow of greed still lingers around the oak grains. My father whispered like that on a crimson afternoon just before he closed his eyes. It was not the last words of a senile old man, but the brutally sharp lucidity of an old fox who had spent 60 years protecting his territory. George Stirling was never deceived by the tears or the kindness of Isabella. In the office filled with the scent of old paper and medicine, he forced me to face a cold reality, that love might be real, but family assets are immutable. A 60-page prenuptial agreement had been prepared by Sebastian Vane, like a solid fortress wall separating my heart from the priceless oak forests. Isabella reacted like a wounded animal when I mentioned that contract 3 weeks before the wedding day. She threw the engagement ring onto the marble tabletop, the dry clink of metal echoing in the silent space of the Stirling Manor. "Do you not trust me, Harry? Or do you think I'm just a gold digger waiting for your father's death to get rich?" She screamed with tears of resentment. I had intended to surrender, intended to tear up those documents to keep the peace, but the gaze of my father from his hospital bed stopped me. He said only one thing, brief and ironclad: no contract, no wedding. Finally, with a face full of contempt and endurance, Isabella set her pen to sign the last page without bothering to glance at the detailed terms inside. She called it a pile of meaningless legal rubbish and declared that her trust in me was more than enough to cover all paper barriers. 18 months later, the air inside Sebastian Vane's office in London became more suffocating than ever as the reading of the will began. Isabella sat beside me, her hand still squeezing mine full of comfort, but I could feel the tightness in her every muscle. Sebastian adjusted his glasses, his steady voice echoing through the room, tearing through the silence. The £4 million legacy from timber rights and investments will only be fully transferred to Harry Sterling after 5 years of maintaining a stable marriage from the day of George Sterling's passing. During that time, the entire sum will remain in a trust fund and cannot be encroached upon by anyone. I glanced at Isabella and saw the smile on her lips vanish in an instant, replaced by a cold calculation appearing in her deep black eyes. But Sebastian had not yet stopped. He cleared his throat, then read the next term that my father called the final character test. However, there is a special case that will trigger immediate asset distribution. If Harry's spouse proactively files for divorce and claims a portion of this very inheritance as communal property, the entire sum of £4 million will immediately belong to the separate and permanent ownership of Harry Sterling without needing to wait for any further days. The room fell into a deadly silence. Isabella remained in the same position, but her breathing had changed, becoming faster and shallower. She had no idea that my father had read through her greed from the very beginning. The will was not just a distribution of assets. It was a sophisticated trap designed for greed to end itself. If Isabella truly loved me, she would have everything after 5 years. But if she could not wait, if she wanted to steal what did not belong to her, she would personally trigger the bomb that destroyed all her dreams of wealth. My heart tightened as I realized that, even lying deep beneath the soil of the Cotswolds, my father was still striving to protect me from my own blindness. The truth began to crack, and beneath the shell of a virtuous wife, the demon of greed was beginning to stir in preparation for an attack that it believed would certainly be victorious. She had no idea that every next move of hers had been carefully calculated by a man who had long been in his grave. Glamour began to corrode the ancient values of the Sterling manor, like a toxic mold clinging to the oak grains. Only a few months after the reading of the will, Isabella seemed to have completely stripped away the cloak of a modest conservationist to don the vulgar luxury of a London high society lady. Shopping trips to Harrods became as frequent as daily meals, with designer bags piling up in the hallways that were once only for displaying sacred family heirlooms. She forced me to replace the pickup truck I had been attached to for 10 years with the latest model Range Rover, reasoning that the image of sterling timber could not be tarnished by old-fashioned poverty. When I began to worry that the company's cash flow was being drained for meaningless renovation projects, Isabella only replied with a calculating sneer. "We will have £4 million in a few years. Harry, do not be too stingy with your own future," she said in a commanding tone instead of her former comforting one. On the other side of the boundary of the ancient oak forests in the Cotswolds, another pair of resentful eyes was also silently observing this fracture. Julian Blackwood, the owner of a sawmill on the brink of bankruptcy, had always harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Sterling family. He had never forgotten the humiliating defeat in 2016 when my father had beaten him to win the contract to supply rare oak for the restoration of Westminster Abbey. Julian saw in Isabella not just a greedy woman, but also a perfect weapon to destroy my empire from within. He began to approach her at the local riding club, using fake generosity and sinister legal advice to lure her into a deadly game. Julian had cleverly planted in Isabella's head the idea that she did not need to wait 5 years to receive crumbs from my table. He spoke to her about loopholes in British law, where a wife's non-financial contribution could turn private property into communal property if it could be proven she helped the business grow. Isabella began to change her attitude, from a virtuous wife to a cold supervisor, always demanding to see quarterly revenue reports and land ownership contracts. She began to record every event, every conversation, preparing for a legal assault that she believed she was certain to win. I stood quietly in my office, looking out at the oak forests changing color in the evening sun, my heart heavy as I realized the woman I once loved most was silently sharpening the knife to stab me in the back. Isabella did not know that every extravagant shopping act, every time she met Julian Blackwood, was recorded by me with a terrifying patience. She thought I was a weak old man being led by the nose by her beauty and cleverness. But the truth was, she was weaving the net that would tighten around her own neck when the deciding moment arrived. Her betrayal was no longer a suspicion, but had become a clear operational plan, pulled by the strings of my family's greatest enemy. However, true power did not lie in designer bags or the hollow promises of Julian Blackwood, but in the will sitting quietly in Sebastian Vane's safe, waiting for Isabella's greed to make its final wrong move. The end of a chapter full of deception was approaching, and Isabella was still infatuated with her millionaire dream, completely unaware that she was standing on the edge of the abyss of total bankruptcy. Isabella's shrill laughter rang out within the dim space of the ancient local pub, tearing away every last illusion I still held for her. I stood tucked behind the thick wooden door, my heart pounding like a battle drum as I heard my name uttered from Julian Blackwood's mouth with utter contempt. £15,000 is too small a figure to trade for the collapse of the Sterling Empire, Julian whispered, his voice husky with triumph. Robert Fielding is the best forensic accountant in London. He will find every loophole to prove that your efforts saved this company from Harry's conservatism. Isabella did not deny it. She merely took a sip of wine and smiled, a cold smile I had never seen in our 7 years of marriage. The confrontation that followed immediately at Sterling Manor turned into a dramatic performance where Isabella held the lead role. When I threw out the truths about the £15,000 and the forensic accountant, Isabella did not flinch. She looked straight into my eyes, eyes once full of tenderness that now were only a frozen lake. "You are being paranoid, Harry. It is your excessive anxiety and your habit of controlling money that are suffocating this marriage," she said in a terrifyingly calm tone. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She turned her betrayal into my mistake, turning her greed into worry for the future of us both. 3 weeks later, fate dealt me a painful blow when a bout of acute pneumonia caused me to collapse. I lay on the old oak bed, my breathing heavy and my chest aching as if pierced by thousands of needles. Isabella once again changed her mask. She became a devoted nurse, bringing me bowls of hot soup, checking my temperature every hour, and always staying by my side with sweet words of comfort. "I love you, Harry. We will get through this together," she whispered in my ear while I was drifting in a fever. But the cruel truth emerged late one night when the fever had just subsided. Through the cracked door of the study, I saw my beloved wife frantically rummaging through drawers, photographing every secret contract and important financial document. Under the dim desk lamp, her face clearly revealed a mad ambition, without a single trace of worry for her sick husband in the next room. In that moment, I realized I was not just fighting an illness, but facing the most cold-blooded predator. Isabella believed I was gradually weakening, that the power of the Sterling family would follow me to the grave. She did not know that, even in the heart-wrenching pain, my mind was sharper than ever. I quietly observed from behind the door, memorizing every movement, every act of stealing the legacy. Isabella thought she held the upper hand when she obtained those documents, but she was gravely mistaken. What she was gathering were only the crumbs that my father and I had arranged to lure her deeper into the trap with no escape. Disgust surged in my throat, bitter and harsh. A woman who can care for you by day and seek to destroy you by night is truly a real-life nightmare. However, that pain forged an iron will. I was no longer the 63-year-old man, defeated by blind love. I was the head of the Sterling family, and my true power did not lie in the figure she had just captured, but in the truth being hidden behind this low-class theatrical veil. That night, beneath my heavy breathing, I silently promised my father that his sacrifice would not be in vain. Isabella had chosen the path of betrayal, and I would be the one to lead her to the end she deserved. A horrific collapse at the peak of her greed. The oak forests of the Cotswolds would witness the end of a pretender, and I would stand firm to protect what belonged to blood and tradition. Truth is not a sweet pill. It is a stream of ice-cold water running down my spine as I looked into my father's eyes on the computer screen late one night in London. Sebastian Vane had handed me the small storage drive with a face as solemn as if he were handing me a death sentence or a key to resurrection. Inside the silent office of Sterling Manor, I plugged the storage drive into the computer, and old George's face appeared. gaunt, yet his eyes still as sharp as a hawk observing prey from above. Harry, if you are watching these films, it means your kind heart has begun to be betrayed by its own blindness. My father's voice rang out, low and full of authority. He revealed a terrifying truth that he had never trusted Isabella from the very first moment she stepped onto the estate. My father had secretly hired a top private investigator to uncover the entire skillfully hidden past of the woman I called my wife. Isabella was not a heritage conservation expert or a true nature-loving soul. She was a professional fortune hunter, a person who specialized in staging romantic scenarios to infiltrate wealthy families. My father produced a file on the screen listing 2 scandalous staged divorces in Edinburgh and Manchester that she had carried out before finding me. In Edinburgh, she had taken nearly £1 million from a building contractor after 3 years of marriage. In Manchester, the same scenario repeated with a stock investor. Each time, she played the role of a devoted but mistreated wife to win the sympathy of the court and carve up the victim's assets. The gala in Oxford 7 years ago was not fate. It was a carefully calculated ambush. Isabella had studied the history of the Sterling family, knew the pain of my wife's passing, and turned herself into the perfect piece I was searching for. My father looked straight into the camera lens, his lips curling into a bitter yet wise smile. The will provision regarding the £4 million inheritance was not an unreasonable control, Harry. It was a self-destruct trap specifically for greed. If she truly loved you, 5 years of waiting would be nothing. But if she only wanted money, greed would push her to file for divorce and demand a share of that inheritance before the 5-year term. The very moment she set her pen to sign the divorce petition and demanded a single penny from those £4 million, she would personally trigger the clause that left her completely empty-handed. It was the final character test that father gave this woman. I collapsed into the chair, feeling extreme contempt for myself for being so naive, but at the same time, a new surge of power arose. I was no longer a weak victim. Exactly 1 week later, when I had just recovered from my illness, Isabella walked into the room with a file in her hand, her face no longer showing a single trace of fake concern. She wore her expensive Burberry coat, standing tall like a queen who had just won a victory. "Harry, this marriage has reached its end," she declared coldly. "I filed for divorce in the London court this morning. My solicitor, Mrs. Amanda Price, believes I have enough evidence to prove my contribution to the growth of sterling timber. I demand £2 million from your father's inheritance and half of this estate as worthy compensation for the 6 years of my youth I wasted here." She threw the stack of documents onto the table, looking at me with eyes of pity as if I were a loser who had been stripped of everything. I looked at Isabella, looking deep into the greedy eyes that my father had accurately predicted 18 months ago. She thought she had found a loophole in the will, thought the support of Julian Blackwood and the accountant Fielding would help her seize the Sterling family legacy. She had no idea that the very act of filing for divorce and demanding £2 million had officially slammed shut the gates of the heaven she had always dreamed of. Isabella was still smiling triumphantly, waiting for my collapse. But she would soon realize she had just personally signed the death sentence for her fortune-hunting career. True power does not lie in the hands of the attacker, but in the hands of the one who has anticipated every move of the opponent. Her game of deception was over, and the final judgment of the Sterling family was waiting for her ahead, where the truth would be exposed under the brutal light of British justice. Monday morning in London was cold and gray, exactly like the end that fate had reserved for greed. Isabella walked into courtroom 12 with the appearance of a queen about to be crowned, her Burberry coat hugging her body with pride. She had no idea she was walking into a trap that had been set for 5 generations. Solicitor Amanda Price boldly presented Isabella's contributions that were not financial, producing the report from forensic accountant Robert Fielding as ironclad evidence to claim £2 million. She looked at me with a triumphant gaze, an obvious contempt for the husband she believed was completely defeated. However, Sebastian Vane stood up, slow and calm like a watchtower amidst a storm. He smiled, a smile that made Isabella recoil with a shiver. "Your Honor, The very report that Mrs. Sterling spent £15,000 to produce is the evidence that betrays her. Sebastian loudly read out Fielding's conclusion. Under Isabella's interference, company revenue had decreased by 10%, and there was no evidence whatsoever to show that her contributions increased the value of the legacy. Isabella was stunned, her breath catching in her throat as she realized she had personally destroyed her own sharpest argument. The final blow was my father's will. Sebastian read the reversal trigger clause aloud to the entire court. Because Mrs. Isabella Sterling has filed for divorce and officially claimed a portion of the £4 million inheritance, she has personally triggered the condition to terminate all rights. This sum immediately becomes the separate, inviolable property of Harry Sterling. Judge Davies struck the gavel against the wooden table, the sound echoing like a death sentence for all of Isabella's ambitions. The verdict was delivered quickly. Isabella received not a single penny from the inheritance, and she was even held fully responsible for the £100,000 credit card debt and all the legal costs of this trial. In the corner of the courtroom, Julian Blackwood quietly stood up and slunk out like a sewer rat driven into the light. He had abandoned his pawn the moment he sensed the taste of defeat. Isabella completely collapsed on the oak bench, her lifeless eyes staring into space as she realized she was empty-handed after 6 years of acting. Her downfall was not caused by me, but was the inevitable consequence of the weight of the very greed she worshipped. 3 years have passed since that day. I stand amidst the ancient oak forest of the Cotswolds, feeling the breath of my ancestors in every cool autumn breeze. I used the £4 million to modernize sterling timber, investing in sustainable harvesting technology and preserving the values that 5 generations of my family had painstakingly built. My father's last letter is now framed in glass and placed prominently in my office at Sterling Manor. Every time I look at those firm handwritten lines, I remember the most costly lesson of my life. Protecting a legacy is not just about keeping money, but about protecting the soul of the family from those who only want to harvest without ever planting. Every Sunday, I bring an oak branch to visit my father's grave, looking at the words carved in stone, George Sterling, the man who built and protected sustainably. The oak forest still stands firm through many seasons of storms, rising proudly under the English sky, and the Sterling family will do the same. I have learned to see through the darkness of the human heart, and am grateful to my late father who protected me from eternity. My journey ends here, where truth has triumphed over deception and loyalty has defeated betrayal. What do you think about the way my father set the test for Isabella? If you were in my situation, would you be clear-headed enough to trust in dry legal clauses, or would you let your emotions lead you into the abyss? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below so we can discuss how to protect the core values of the family. If you found this story brought a meaningful lesson, do not forget to press like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories about courage and wisdom in life. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next journeys.